Hello, my name is Dietmar Dörschlag, and I am a business consultant with Expium, a Valiantis company, and we are, of course, an Atlassian Platinum Solution Partner. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I want to talk with you about configuring permissions in Jira with a focus on how and when to use groups or project roles. I admit that when I first started to deal with this topic, the concept of having to have groups and role permissions in Jira was a bit confusing. But the more I dug into it, the more I really started to appreciate the flexibility that Jira allows to set up permissions that are right for your organization. Before I dive into Jira, and on my screen here I have a Jira sandbox open, I want to just start by saying how I think important it is to get the permission set up right. You really want to spend some time to really think through the governance of your projects. Who can access your projects? Who should not be allowed to access them at all? And what permissions do you want to give to each user? Now, as well, you want to consider what are users allowed to do in your project. For example, are they allowed to just view issues and maybe add an attachment or add a comment, or should they be allowed to edit issues or maybe even manage sprints, transition issues across a Kanban board? So it's really important that you figure out all of what your business needs during business discovery sessions before you build out permissions in Jira. You want to be sure that sensitive information is protected and it doesn't get into the wrong hands just because you did not build permissions correctly. So thinking this through is really, really important. Now, the first thing I want to say is that there is, of course, a big difference between a company managed and a team managed project in Jira. Atlassian used to call company managed projects classic projects, and now they refer to them as next gen projects. So let's dive into this a little bit more. Now, in my sandbox instance, I set up a team managed project. Now, a team managed project is really the way to go for self-contained project teams where you do not want to share the settings across the organization. That's when you want to set up a team managed project. So in my team managed project, Jira out of the box comes with different roles: an administrator role, a member, a viewer role. You can add additional roles as well, but out of the box, Jira provides 3 default roles, and these roles come with default permission settings. Now, you want to keep in mind that team managed projects, of course, have significantly less functionality. For example, they come with only 5 or 6 canned reports, and also you are not able to share different type of schemes from other projects into a team managed projects. So for example, if you have set up workflow schemes, permission schemes, customized screens, they cannot be shared into a team managed project. But team managed projects are a great way to lock down access into a project. Let's look at this. So for example, in my team managed project, I could simply switch access to limited, and then limiting access to a team managed project in Jira out of the box provides much less permissions to users. In a limited project, they can only view issues. They would not be able to edit issues or do things that would be possible in a fully open project. Here, under project access, I would simply switch from, let's say, open, where users can view, create, and edit issues, to limited, where they can only view issues, but they would no longer be able to edit issues. Now let's switch to company managed projects. As the name suggests, company managed projects are type of projects which cannot be set up by anyone. They are really typically set up by Jira administrators. And Jira administrators configure the schemes, including a permission scheme, which is then shared across many, many projects. A Jira administrator sets up the permissions, and that permission scheme then works for most projects and is shared against multiple projects. Of course, a permission scheme can be tweaked to suffice the needs in a particular project. That is always possible. So what I have open here on my screen in my sandbox environment is a company managed project which has a permission scheme. And that permission scheme, which is a scheme that is shared with other projects, can be tweaked to suffice the particular needs on that project alone. Now, in the permission scheme, if I open the permission scheme, having the permission scheme open for that particular company managed project, you see that for each permission level, and there are many, many permission levels, you can assign roles, project roles, or project groups. That's a very important concept that I want to focus a little bit more. Groups are set up by site or org administrators. Yes, you heard that correctly. A Jira administrator is not able to set up groups. Why is that? Well, simply because groups can be looked at just like containers of users, and very often assigning users to those groups has licensing and therefore financial implications, which is best left to a site admin, not a Jira admin who also has line of sight into budgets. A site admin defines, sets up the appropriate groups, and would then also add users to those groups. A Jira admin would then add those groups defined by a site admin and simply add them to a permission scheme, which is then used across multiple projects. Now, don't be scared. Certainly, a site admin is not required to manually enter all those users. You can certainly import those users easily, and it's very, very convenient how Jira allows you to create groups and then simply add users to those groups. Now, staying on the topic of global permissions on user groups for a moment, this is where global permissions really come in. Now, there are 6 or 7 global permissions. Those global permissions are very important. As the name suggests, they are used across all products in your instance. So Jira Service Management, Jira Core, and those permissions, those global permissions are very powerful. Now, because they are so powerful, they should be administered by a site administrator, and this is done through groups. So global permissions is one area in Jira that only work for groups. You would not be able to put project roles onto global permissions. You have to have groups defined, which are then assigned to global permissions. Now let's switch to project roles. Project roles are a very powerful tool in Jira to customize your permissions for a particular project. So a Jira site or org administrator would go from the cog into systems and would then define project roles. And those project roles can be manifold. So a typical project role would be, let's use an example. You have developers on a software project, and you know exactly what those developers typically do. For example, they would be assigned to an issue, they can edit issues, they would be allowed to edit comments and attachments, they would transition issues to another workflow status once complete, and so on. You would now define a developer role, and you would then define the permission levels for that developer role, and that permission setting through a scheme is then shared across multiple projects. Now, because roles, project roles, are typically used over and over again across the enterprise, just as is the case with groups, it's really again left to the site or the org administrator to create roles. The Jira administrator defines the permissions that each role would have, and that's done in a permission scheme. We're going to look at that in a minute. It is the project administrator who plugs project team members into the project role. When I was a project manager or an IT PMO manager, the composition of my team members changed a lot. People leave, people get hired, they move on to different projects. Team membership is really very dynamic. And this is exactly why swapping people in and out of project roles in Jira is really best left to a Jira project administrator. For example, that could be a project manager, someone who is very close to a project. The Jira administrator or the site administrator, they could simply not keep up with the dynamic of changing team membership all the time. Now, where the concept of groups and project roles comes together is in the concept of permission schemes. So when you go to Jira and you go to your issues configuration menu and you browse down to permission schemes, this is where this is set up. And again, a permission scheme is typically shared across multiple projects or could be set up for just one project, but it's typically shared across multiple projects. So let's look at a permission scheme that I set up. Permission schemes are very powerful. There are many, many levels in how you can set up those permissions. There are issue permissions. There are, of course, voters and watcher permissions. There are comment permissions, etc. Now, for each permission that's set up here, you can add one or multiple groups. Again, groups were defined by the site or org administrator who assigned members to those groups. You can select multiple groups, but you can, of course, also assign a permission level to a project role. And you can do this for one or several project roles. So Jira is very powerful in allowing you to use both roles and groups to define the permissions in the permission scheme at your project. Of course, Jira is smart enough to know that the role in itself cannot be a member of another role. I was really intrigued by how flexible Jira is, how you can see that you can not only assign a permission to groups and roles, but you can also assign them to individual users, project leads, current assignee, and you can even use a custom field value to define permissions at the project level. Now, in closing, here are a few takeaways from today's conversation. Jira is very flexible how you can set up permissions, which of course determine what users can and cannot do, what they can and can do, cannot do, can and cannot see. Now, I encourage you to really take the time to think through how you want to set up permissions. Really think it through and invest that time up front. It's really worth it and it pays off in the long run. Also, of course, setting it up once sets the foundation, as the permission schemes that you define will likely be reused over and over again. We talked about groups and project roles. They're set up by site administrators only. They define what groups should be used and what project roles should be used across Jira. Group members are assigned by site administrators. Remember that project administrators, and yes, also Jira administrators, cannot assign users to individual groups. Why? Because it has licensing implications. We talked about role members and how role members can be assigned by project administrators because they are the closest to a particular project. It allows the flexibility in a very dynamic team environment, and it deserves also for project administrators to do that because it removes the administrative burden from site and Jira admins. I encourage you to build out a repeatable permission scheme, what we just looked at. Think through what users typically do. Build the permissions once and then reuse that scheme across all projects. As we said, of course, you can tweak a permission scheme to meet the needs of a particular project. It's generally recommended that you use roles. Administering roles is much easier. They're very flexible. Roles can easily control what users can do, what users cannot do, who gets notifications, and many other things. Roles are a great way to configure permissions across Jira. There's certain concepts, however, that do require groups. We talked about global permissions today. Other settings that require groups would be configuring product access. For example, who has even access to Jira, Jira Service Management, Conference, etc. And of course, there are concepts like setting group filters, which, as the name suggests, require the setup of groups. Well, that's it. Here you have it. That was a whirlwind journey through Jira Permissions with a focus on groups versus projects. I know, speaking from my own experience, it's a little bit daunting at first, but I promise you, once you really dive into it, you will really love the flexibility that Jira provides in how you can configure permissions, the way it works for your organization. In the end, that's what's really all about, isn't it? Thank you very much for joining me today. Have a great day in Jira Land.